You know, after 15 years of cutting into corpses, you think nothing could surprise me anymore. Dead bodies don't talk, they don't move, and they sure as hell don't make music. At least, that's what I believed until that October night when I met Jasper Crow. It was pushing midnight when they wheeled him in. I should have gone home hours ago, but the DA's office was breathing down my neck about the backlog. Budget cuts meant half the staff, twice the work. Story of my life, really. Jasper looked like your typical street musician. Weathered hands, calloused fingertips, clothes that had seen better decades. The paramedics found him slumped over his guitar case near the subway entrance. Heart attack, probably. Happened to these guys more often than you'd think. Bad diet, worse habits, sleeping rough in all kind of weather. His body was just done. I wheeled him into the prep room and got to work. Standard procedure. Photographs, measurements, external examination. Nothing unusual. Just another sad story in a city full of them. That's when I heard it. A soft whistling, like someone casually walking down a hallway without a care in the world. Melodic, almost cheerful. I paused, scalpel in hand, and listened. The sound seemed to drift from the cold storage room where we kept the other bodies. Hello. I called out. Silence. Must be the night janitor, I figured. Louis sometimes worked late, though he usually announced himself. I went back to my work, making the Y incision across Jasper's chest. The whistling started again. This time it was closer, definitely coming from the storage room, but there was something off about it. The melody was complex, not something you'd absent-mindedly whistle while mopping floors. It had structure, purpose, like a song someone had practiced 1,000 times. I set down my tools and walked to the storage room. The heavy door was already open, which was odd. I always kept it sealed. 24 refrigerated drawers lined the walls, each one numbered and tagged. All quiet, all still. Luis, you in here? Nothing. I checked the hallway, the break room, even the supply closet. Empty. The building was locked up tight, and my key card was the only one that showed access after 10 p.m. Back in the prep room, I tried to focus on Jasper. Poor guy deserved better than a distracted autopsy. But as I examined his heart, enlarged just as I'd suspected, the whistling started again. Louder now, more confident. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, like something you'd hear in an old folk song. It seemed to drift and flow, sometimes coming from the storage room, sometimes from right behind me. I spun around twice, nearly dropping my instruments. But I was alone, just me and Jasper. That's when I noticed his hands. When they'd brought him in, his fingers had been curled in the typical post-mortem position. Now they looked relaxed, almost as if they were positioned to play an invisible instrument. I stared at those callous fingertips, the ones that had probably coaxed music from guitar strings for decades. The whistling grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely the same melody, but now I could hear variations, little trills and flourishes that spoke of real musicianship. My skin crawled as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the storage room anymore. It was coming from the table. I backed away, my rational mind screaming that this was impossible. Dead men don't whistle. Dead men don't do anything except lie there and slowly decompose. But Jasper's chest, split open and empty, seemed to be moving slightly with each note. This isn't happening, I whispered to myself. Stress, exhaustion, too much caffeine. But the melody continued, growing more elaborate. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a song that seemed to carry all the loneliness and hope of someone who'd spent their life performing for spare change in empty streets. I forced myself to step closer. This was insane, but I needed to know. As I leaned over Jasper's body, the whistling stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. Then I saw them. His lips. They were pursed just slightly, in the perfect position for whistling. And they were moving. Not much. Just the tiniest adjustment position, like a musician fine-tuning their embouchure. I stumbled backward, knocking over my instrument tray. The crash echoed to the morgue like a gunshot. In the ringing aftermath, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Applause. Slow, deliberate clapping coming from the storage room. Then another set of hands joined in. Then another. Soon it sounded like a whole audience appreciating a performance I couldn't see. I ran to the storage room and yanked open drawer after drawer. Empty. All of them empty. But the applause continued, growing louder, more enthusiastic. I slammed the last drawer shut, and the sound stopped instantly. When I returned to the prep room, Jasper was exactly as I had left him. Body open, organs exposed, completely still, but there was something different about his face. Where before he looked tired and worn down by life, now there was a peaceful expression, almost satisfied. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I finished the autopsy. Cause of death: myocardial infarction, just as I'd suspected. Nothing unusual in the toxicology, just a tired old musician whose heart gave out. But as I was filling out the paperwork, I found something in his jacket pocket that I'd missed during the initial examination. A crumpled piece of sheet music, handwritten in faded pencil. The title at the top read, "The Last Song," and the melody matched exactly what I'd been hearing all night. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, was a note: "For anyone who listens when the halls are quiet and the audience has gone home." I never heard Jasper whistle again, but sometimes, during those long midnight shifts, I catch myself humming his melody, and I swear in the deepest quiet of the morgue, I can hear the faint sound of applause drifting from the storage room. The dead, I've learned, sometimes have one last song to sing. Story 2. The power went out at 11:43 p.m. I know because I was staring at the clock on my computer screen when everything went black. 1 second I was typing up a report. The next I was sitting in absolute darkness listening to the mechanical hum of the morgue slowly die away. Emergency lighting kicked in after about 30 seconds, those dim red bulbs that make everything look like a horror movie set, which, considering where I work, wasn't exactly comforting. But it was enough to see by, and I had work to finish. The city was experiencing rolling blackouts all week due to some issue with the power grid, and bodies don't stop coming just because the lights go out. I grabbed the battery-powered lantern from my desk and headed to the prep room. Valentina Frost was waiting for me. A 34-year-old woman found frozen solid in her apartment after the heat had been shut off. Landlord dispute, tragic really. She'd been dead for at least 3 days before anyone found her, and I needed to get the autopsy done before the family arrived in the morning. The thing about working in a morgue during a power outage is that you become acutely aware of how much you depend on electricity. The ventilation system, the lights, the computers, but most importantly, the refrigeration units. Without power, those bodies start warming up fast. And trust me, that's not something you want to experience. I set up candles around the examination table, the kind we keep for emergencies. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, making everything feel surreal. Valentina lay on the table, still partially frozen despite being out of cold storage for an hour. Her skin had that waxy, pale quality that comes with hypothermia, and her dark hair was stiff with ice crystals. I started with the external examination, photographing everything with a battery-powered camera. That's when I first noticed something odd. While the other bodies in the morgue were starting to reach room temperature, I could actually smell the beginning of decomposition from the storage room. Valentina remained ice cold. I mean really cold. Cold enough that my breath became visible when I leaned over her. I pulled back and watched as a small puff of vapor escaped my lips. The room wasn't that cold. Chilly, sure, but not freezing. I moved closer again, trying to be scientific about it. My breath missed it immediately. It was like she was generating her own personal winter. I touched her arm with my gloved hand and actually winced. Even through the latex, the cold was so intense it burned. What the hell? I muttered, reaching for my thermometer. The reading was impossible. -22 degrees Fahrenheit. That was colder than when she'd been brought in from the apartment. She should have been warming up, not getting colder. I set the thermometer aside and tried to focus on the job. Maybe the equipment was malfunctioning. Old building, emergency power, stranger things had happened. I started the Y incision, working by candlelight like some medieval barber surgeon. The scalpel scraped against her frozen skin, making an unpleasant grinding sound. Ice crystals formed on the blade with each cut. My hands were getting numb despite the surgical gloves, and I had to keep pausing to warm them under my arms. That's when I noticed the frost. It started as a thin layer on the metal table around her body, but it was spreading, slowly, deliberately, like watching ice form on a windshield. The frost crept across the surface, onto my instruments, up the sides of the table. When I looked up, I could see it begin to form on the walls. The temperature in the room was dropping fast. My breath wasn't just visible now. It was coming out in thick, white clouds. The candle flame started flickering more violently, as if fighting against an invisible wind. I stepped back on the table, pulling my lab coat tighter around myself. This wasn't possible. Bodies don't generate cold. Heat, sure, decomposition creates heat. But cold? Never. That's when I made the mistake of looking at her face. Her eyes were open. I know they'd been closed when I started. I always check that sort of thing. It's basic procedure. But now those pale blue eyes were staring straight up at the ceiling, and there was something in them that made my stomach drop. They were tracking. I moved to the left, and the eyes followed. I moved to the right. Same thing. Subtle movements. Barely perceptible, but definitely there. And they were looking at me with what I can only describe as recognition. "This is not happening," I said out loud, my voice echoing strangely in the freezing air. Cadaveric spasm. Post-mortem muscle contraction. Perfectly normal. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. The frost was spreading faster now, covering the walls in delicate, intricate patterns that looked almost decorative. Beautiful, if you ignore the fact that they were impossible. My fingers were going numb, and I could see my breath with every exhale. I reached for my phone to call. Who? The power company? My supervisor? 911. What was I supposed to say? Help! My corpse is air-conditioned in the morgue? The phone screen was fogged with condensation, but I could see it was working. No signal, though. The cell towers must have been affected by the blackout. I looked back at Valentina. The frost around her body had formed into elaborate, snowflake-like patterns. It was actually beautiful, like something you'd see on a greeting card. But her eyes, those eyes were still watching me. I forced myself to step closer. "You're dead," I whispered, as if saying out loud would make it true. "You've been dead for days. This is just some kind of chemical reaction, crystallization, something scientific." But as I leaned over her, those eyes moved again. And this time, I swear I saw her lips part slightly, as if she was trying to speak. The candles guttered out all at once, plunging the room into that eerie red emergency lighting. In the sudden dimness, I could see something that made my heart stop. The frost wasn't random. It was forming words. Spelled out across the wall in delicate ice crystals were two words, so cold. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Grabbed my keys, left everything behind, and bolted for the exit. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, shivering and trying to convince myself I was having some kind of breakdown. When the power came back on at 2:17 a.m., I forced myself to go back inside. Everything was normal. Room temperature. No frost, no ice, no impossible words on the wall. Valentina was exactly as I'd left her, eyes closed, warming up like any normal corpse should. I finished the autopsy by dawn. Cause of death: hypothermia, just as expected. Nothing unusual in the examination. Just a woman who'd frozen to death in her own apartment. But I can't forget those eyes, or the way the frost spelled out her final words. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the cold took more than just her life. If maybe, somehow, it took a piece of her with it into whatever comes after. I've requested a transfer to the day shift. Can't stand the thought of working alone in the dark anymore. Some deaths, I've learned, never really warm up. Story 3. I'd seen Lysander Webb's work before he ended up on my table. Crime scene photography. The man had an eye for capturing death in all its grim detail. Professional, clinical, but somehow artistic too. He could make even the most brutal murder scene look like something out of noir film. Dark stuff, but necessary. We needed guys like him to document the truth. Finding him dead in his own darkroom felt like cosmic irony. The police said it looked like a heart attack, probably brought on by the chemicals he worked with day in and day out. Developer, fixer, stop bath, that cocktail toxins would eventually get anyone. He was only 42, but he'd been breathing that stuff for 20 years. What struck me first was how peaceful he looked. Most heart attack victims die in agony, clutching their chests, faces twisted in pain. But Lysander looked almost content, like he'd finally gotten the perfect shot and could rest easy. His camera was still around his neck when they brought him in. An old Leica, real vintage piece. The kind of camera that serious photographers swear by. There was film in it, half a roll of black and white, 35 millimeters. The detective asked me to develop it, see if there was anything relevant to his death. Sometimes people document their own final moments without realizing it. I should have sent it to the lab, but I'd done darkroom work in college. Besides, it felt wrong to let strangers handle his last pictures. The man deserved that much respect. I set up a temporary darkroom in the basement storage area. Black out the windows, red light, chemical baths. Just like riding a bicycle, muscle memory taking over. The familiar smell of developer brought back memories of late nights in art school, watching images slowly emerge from blank paper like ghosts materializing from ether. The first few shots were standard crime scene work. A break-in from the previous week. Overturned furniture, broken glass, blood spatter on the walls. Lysander's usual meticulous composition. Every detail sharp and purposeful. Nothing unusual. Then I got a frame 7. It was his darkroom. The same room where they'd found him. But the photo was taken from an impossible angle. High up, looking down at the space where his body would eventually be discovered. Like he'd mounted the camera on the ceiling or something. The timestamp on the film edge showed it was taken just hours before his death. Strange, but not alarming. Maybe he was experimenting with new perspectives. Artists do weird things sometimes. Frame 8 made my hands shake. It was me, in the morgue, performing an autopsy on a body I couldn't quite make out. The photo was incredibly detailed. You could see the concentration on my face, the way my hair fell across my forehead when I leaned over the examination table. But I'd never seen this photo before. Hell, I'd never even met Lysander Webb while he was alive. I stared at the image for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd photographed me during some other case, and I'd forgotten? But no, I could see the details of the morgue clearly. This was definitely my workplace, and that was definitely me. The photo looked recent. I was wearing the same lab coat I bought just last month. My heart was pounding as I developed frame 9. Same scene, but closer. Now I could see the body on the table clearly. It was Lysander himself. The photo showed me performing his autopsy, but that was impossible. The timestamp showed this was taken before his death, before he'd even been brought to the morgue. I dropped the photo and stepped back from the developer bath. This was insane. Photos don't show the future. Cameras capture light, nothing more. There had to be some explanation. But when I looked at the next frame, my blood went cold. It was the same scene again, but this time something was wrong. There was a shadow behind me in the photo. A tall, thin shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. It looked like a person standing just outside the frame, watching me work. I spun around, half expecting to see someone in the darkroom with me. Nothing, just red light and chemical baths and my own racing heartbeat. Frame 11 showed the shadow more clearly. It was definitely a person, tall, wearing what looked like a long coat. The figure was positioned right behind me, close enough to touch my shoulder. But in the photo, I was completely oblivious, focused on my work. The last frame nearly made me scream. The shadow had a face, and it was looking directly at the camera as if it knew it was being photographed. The features were unclear, distorted by the black and white film, but there was something familiar about them, something that made my skin crawl. It was only when I held the photo under the light that I realized the truth. The shadow had Lysander's face, but not the peaceful expression I'd seen on his corpse. This was different. His eyes were wide, desperate, almost pleading. His mouth was open as if he was trying to scream a warning. I looked at the timestamp again. This photo was taken just 20 minutes before his estimated time of death. I ran upstairs to the morgue, the photos clutched in my trembling hands. Lysander's body was exactly where I'd left it, still waiting for the autopsy. But now, looking at him, I could see something I'd missed before. His camera was positioned differently than when they brought him in. The lens was pointing toward the examination table, toward exactly where I'd be standing when I performed his autopsy. With shaking hands, I checked the camera. There was still one shot left on the roll. I don't know what possessed me to wind the film and press the shutter. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that this was all some kind of hoax. Maybe I wanted to see what would happen. The flash went off, illuminating the morgue in harsh white light. For just a split second, I could have sworn I saw something else in the room with me, a tall figure standing in the corner, watching. But when my eyes adjusted, I was alone with the dead. I developed that final frame an hour later. It showed me taking the picture, camera raised to my eye. But behind me, clear as day, was Lysander's shadow. Not the peaceful corpse on the table, but something else. Something that had been watching me from the moment I'd started developing his film. In the photo, the shadow was reaching for me. I sealed those photos in an evidence bag and locked them in my desk. The official report listed cause of death as myocardial infarction brought on by chemical exposure. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural. But I can't forget that last image. The way the shadow seemed to move between frames, getting closer each time. The desperate look in those familiar eyes. Sometimes I wonder if Lysander is still taking pictures, still documenting things the rest of us can't see. And sometimes, late at night in the morgue, I hear the faint click of a camera shutter when no one else is around. I never work alone anymore. Can't shake the feeling that someone's always watching, always ready to capture that perfect final shot. Story 4. 37 years, I've been cutting into the dead. You'd think after nearly 4 decades of this work, nothing would surprise me anymore. Bodies tell stories, stories of violence, neglect, disease, accident. I've read them all, filed them away, moved on to the next chapter. But Octavia Ray's story, that one still keeps me up at night. They found her in her Victorian mansion on Elm Street, the one that had been her family for generations. Heart attack, the paramedic said. Not unusual for a woman her age. She was 83, lived alone, surrounded by a lifetime of collecting antiques. The house was stuffed floor to ceiling with music boxes, old photographs, vintage dolls, and curiosities from estate sales. Classic hoarder situation, but organized. Obsessively organized. What caught my attention wasn't her death, straightforward cardiac arrest, but what the police had bagged as evidence. Among her personal effects was an ornate music box, Victorian era, made of dark mahogany with intricate brass fittings. The kind of piece that would sell for thousands at auction. But there was something about it that made me uneasy from the moment I saw it. The craftsmanship was exquisite. When you opened the lid, tiny porcelain figures danced around a central stage, a little orchestra of musicians, each one carved with incredible detail. There was a pianist with his hands poised over miniature keys, a violinist with her bow raised, a conductor frozen mid-gesture, even a small audience seated in tiny chairs, their faces turned toward performers. I almost didn't wind it up, should have listened to that instinct, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned the small brass key on the back, and the mechanism came to life with a soft, melodic tune. Something classical, vaguely familiar. The little figures began to rotate slowly, their performance frozen in time, but somehow still graceful. That's when I noticed something odd about the audience figures. One of them looked familiar. Not just familiar, identical. It was a perfect miniature of Harold Finch, a man I'd autopsied 3 months ago. Suicide by hanging. Case closed weeks ago. But there he was, captured in porcelain, sitting in the front row of his antique music box. I leaned closer, squinting at the tiny face. Same receding hairline, same sharp nose, same expression of resigned sadness I remembered from the examination table. It was impossible, but there was no denying it. My hands were shaking as I examined the other audience members. Margaret Pine, car accident victim from last year. Jerome Walsh, drug overdose from 6 months back. Sarah Chun, drowning victim from the summer. All of them, perfectly recreated in miniature, sitting in their little chairs like they were attending some eternal performance. What the hell? I whispered, setting the music box down on my desk. But the melody kept playing, and the figures kept dancing. And as I watched, horrified, I realized that the musicians on stage weren't random either. The pianist was Robert Mills, a jazz musician I'd examined after a bar fight went wrong. The violinist was Linda Torres, a street performer who died of exposure. Every single figure in that music box was someone who had crossed my examination table. I tried to shut the lid, but it wouldn't close. The music kept playing, growing louder, more insistent. The little figures spun faster, their frozen performances becoming almost frantic. And in the audience, those familiar faces seemed to be turning toward me, their tiny porcelain eyes following my movements. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside my office. But it was past midnight, and I was the only one in the building. Security had done their rounds hours ago. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, a voice, some explanation. Nothing, just silence and the tinkling melody from the music box. When I finally worked up the courage to check the hallway, it was empty, but there were wet footprints on the linoleum floor, small, delicate prints that looked like they'd been made by a woman's dress shoes, the same size that would fit Octavia Wraith. I followed the prints back to my office, where they stopped right in front of my desk, right where I'd been standing when I wound up the music box. The melody was reaching crescendo now, the figures spinning so fast they were almost a blur, but I could still make out their faces. All those people I'd examined, cataloged, and forgotten, they were all here, all watching me with their tiny painted eyes. That's when I noticed the empty chair. In the back row of the miniature audience, there was one chair that had no figure, just an empty seat, waiting. And as I stared at it, I realized with growing horror that it was sized differently from the others, larger, like it was made for someone taller. Some of my size. The music box suddenly stopped, the figures freezing mid-dance. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heart pounding. But there was something else, a faint scratching sound like fingernails on wood. I looked down at the music box and nearly screamed. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. There was a figure sitting in it now, a tall man in a medical examiner's coat, with my face, my tired eyes, my graying beard. The miniature me was slumped forward slightly, eyes closed, looking exactly like a corpse on an examination table. I slammed the music box shut, but the damage was done. I could still hear that melody playing in my head, could still see that empty chair being filled by my own death. I locked the music box in my office safe and tried to forget about it, but over the next few days, I started noticing things. My reflection in the morgue stainless steel surfaces looked tired, older. My hands shook when I held my instruments. My heart skipped beats at random moments. A week later, I had my first heart attack. Minor one, barely noticeable. But as the paramedics wheeled me out of morgue, I could swear I heard that familiar melody drifting from my office. I survived that attack, and the next one, but I know it's only a matter of time. The music box is still in my safe, still waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear it playing even through the steel walls. I've written instructions for my replacement. When my time comes, and it will come soon, they're to destroy that music box. Burn it, smash it, whatever it takes. Some collections should never be completed, but I have a feeling that whoever examines my body will find themselves curious about the personal effects. They'll see that beautiful Victorian music box and think it's too valuable to destroy. They'll wind it up just like I did, and they'll find their own empty chair waiting in the audience. The dead, I've learned, sometimes collect a living. Story 5. They just installed new equipment in the morgue. State-of-the-art examination tables with polished steel surfaces that reflected everything like mirrors. The administration was proud of the upgrade, said it would improve our efficiency and documentation. What they didn't mention was how unsettling it would be to see yourself from every angle while working with the dead. Darius Hollow came to us on a Tuesday morning. 67 years old, found dead in his mirror workshop on the old side of town. The place had been his life's work, handcrafting mirrors using techniques passed down through generations. Victorian-era pieces, Art Deco designs, ornate Baroque frames that belonged in palaces. Beautiful work. But there was something unsettling about a room filled with hundreds of reflective surfaces. The police said it looked like natural causes. Darius was found slumped over his workbench, surrounded by mirror fragments and grinding tools. Probably a stroke or a heart attack. His workshop was a maze of partially completed mirrors, some as tall as doorways, others small enough to fit in your palm. Every surface reflected light in strange ways, creating an almost kaleidoscopic effect. What struck me immediately was how the mirrors had been arranged around his workbench. They formed a perfect circle, all angled inward toward where he'd been sitting, like he'd been watching himself work from every possible angle, or like something else had been watching him. I began the external examination in the new prep room, the overhead lights reflecting off every steel surface. That's when I first noticed something was wrong with my reflection. In the polished surface of the examination table, I could see myself leaning over Darius's body, normal enough, but in the reflection, I was using different instruments than the ones in my actual hands. When I picked up the scalpel, my reflection was holding forceps. When I reached for the measuring tape, the reflection showed me writing notes. I stopped and stared at the surface, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was the angle or the way the light was hitting the steel. But as I watched, my reflection seemed to be performing an entirely different autopsy. I moved to the other side of the table, and the same thing happened. My reflection was always one step ahead, doing things I hadn't done yet, or maybe things I was going to do. It was like watching a preview of my own actions. That's when I made the mistake of looking at the mirror Darius had been working on when he died. The police had brought it in with his personal effects, a hand mirror with an ornate silver frame, the kind Victorian ladies might have used. The glass was perfectly clear, no cracks or flaws. But when I looked into it, what I saw made my blood freeze. It wasn't my face looking back. It was Darius, very much alive, very much aware, and absolutely terrified. His mouth was moving like he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide with panic, and he was pounding against the glass from the inside like he was trapped. I dropped the mirror, and it clattered across the floor. When I picked it up again, it showed my own reflection, pale, shaken, but normal. Just my own face staring back with barely controlled fear. I tried to focus on the autopsy, but every reflective surface in the room was betraying me now. The steel countertops showed me completing procedures I hadn't started. The glass cabinet doors reflected me having conversations with people who weren't there. Even the polished instruments seemed to hold glimpses of actions I hadn't taken. But the worst was Darius's hand mirror. Every time I glanced at it, he was there, sometimes screaming silently, sometimes just staring with those desperate eyes. Once, I saw him holding up what looked like a piece of paper with writing on it, but I couldn't make out the words. I forced myself to continue the examination. External inspection showed no obvious trauma, no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, just an old man who'd apparently died peacefully at his workbench. But as I worked, I kept catching glimpses of other reflections. In the steel table surface, I saw myself discovering something horrible inside his chest cavity. In the cabinet glass, my reflection was backing away from the body in terror. In his hand mirror, Darius was frantically pointing at something behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. Just the empty morgue and the humming of fluorescent lights. When I turned back, every reflective surface in the room showed the same thing. Me, but not me. Dozens of versions of myself, all performing different actions, all discovering different horrors. Some were running from the room. Others were calling for help. One reflection showed me collapsed on the floor. But in Darius's mirror, he was calm now, almost peaceful, and he was pointing directly at his own chest. With trembling hands, I began the internal examination. Heart looked normal, lungs clear, no obvious cause of death. But as I worked deeper, my reflections grew more agitated. They were all trying to tell me something, all gesturing frantically at things I couldn't see. That's when I found it. Hidden in the pericardial sac around his heart was a small piece of mirror glass, perfectly smooth, impossibly sharp, and warm to the touch despite being inside a corpse. As soon as I removed it, every reflection in the room went still. But Darius's hand mirror showed something new. It was me, but older, much older, with gray hair and wrinkled skin. This other version of myself was holding the same piece of mirror glass, examining it with curiosity. And behind her, behind the older me, I could see Darius, no longer trapped, but free. And he was smiling. I dropped the glass fragment, and it shattered on the floor. Immediately, all the reflections returned to normal, my face in every surface, showing exactly what I was actually doing. The mirrors were just mirrors again. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen, that older version of myself, examining the same mysterious glass. The way Darius had looked relieved to be free of it. I completed the autopsy and filed my report. Cause of death: foreign object in pericardial cavity causing cardiac tamponade. The mirror glass had slowly pierced his heart over what must have been years. A bizarre accident, probably caused by working too closely with sharp glass fragments. But I kept thinking about those reflections, about the way they seemed to show the future or alternate versions of events, about how Darius had looked trapped in his own mirror until I freed him. 3 days later, I cut myself on a piece of broken glass while cleaning my instruments. Just a small cut on my palm, barely worth a bandage. But that night, I started noticing things in mirrors. Little differences in my reflection. Sometimes I was wearing different clothes, or my hair was styled differently. Sometimes I looked older or younger or sadder. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the morgue, I see Darius in the reflective surfaces. Not trapped this time, but warning, pointing at my reflection, trying to tell me something I'm not ready to understand. I've stopped looking directly into mirrors. Can't shake the feeling that one day I'll see myself looking back from the wrong side of the glass. Some reflections, I've learned, show more than just what's in front of them. They show what's coming.